Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Master Your Life with Kate McKay. I am very excited for you to join this episode where I get to interview a dark and epic fantasy author named J.V. Hilliard. Welcome, JV.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Super pumped. And as I always say, I love the big conversations that we have before we hit play. And I just had to basically, JV, I was like, no, don't talk. Wait a second. I have to hit play because you're about to launch into a really cool story. So I would love it if you would share with the listeners, what is epic dark fantasy? Like, what is that?
Sure. So, people are always familiar with sci-fi and fantasy stuff. When you think sci-fi, you think outer space, you think futuristic, right? Fantasy is the opposite. It's magical realms, typically set in a medieval society or ancient society, and so I'm on the back end of that. But when you think of the types of fantasy that are out there, there's classical fantasy like Dungeons and Dragons, and then there are things that are called sword and sorcery, like Conan the Barbarian, where magic is very thin and it's not seen as much. But epic fantasy is very Tolkien-esque. It's very Lord of the Rings. It's Game of Thrones. It's this large world that has a history and a present, and it has a future, and it's got its own magic systems, and it has its own. And you've built this world around it that gives it more than just one book's worth of novels. And typically, you see series upon series when you get into epic fantasy, and they also have a tendency to be a little longer, around 150,000 words and up. And so my novels focus on that. The dark aspect of it is when the heroes don't always win. And so when you look at Tolkien, to use that, because he's kind of the granddaddy of them all, the Hobbit wins. And, in the Lord of the Rings series, the good guys win and it teaches a lesson, and it's good versus evil. And it's this clash of thing. And, and then you're saving the world, right? Um, it's dark fantasy is more like what Martin writes for Game of Thrones, which is we might love these characters, but they're not all going to live through it, right? And sometimes the bad guys win because they're smart too. And so you get villains that often will be portrayed in a way that a protagonist would. And so I've been able to combine what I think is epic fantasy with a little bit of gothic, a little bit of dark, and making it a little bit more adultish as opposed to, good guys always win.
Oh my gosh, this sounds so good. So your work before this, I think, is a great it was great preparation for you because you had to do all these things in your previous work. Can you talk a little bit about the parallels between the two and maybe
Yeah.
how they're very different?
Yeah, so prior to me becoming an author, and I was a COVID author. There's a whole group of people out there that decided to write their that book that's been rattling around in their head whenever they didn't have anything to do, and that's what happened to me. But prior to that, I had spent 20 years in DC as a defense lobbyist primarily, and during that time, I saw countries negotiate, states negotiate, companies negotiate, and there was a complexity that overlaps those things that really lend itself to writing stories and learning lessons that you can use in epic fantasy. So I saw how nations negotiated with one another. I saw how they rattled sabers. I saw how they informed their military and how they provided for their common defenses and promoted their general welfares, right? So for me, I saw that day to day, and I took some of those lessons, and as you can imagine, embedded them into really cool plot lines. Now, of course, the names are different, and there's no magic in the real world, and things like that too. But there were things that I saw by working with the Pentagon, for example, and you'll see sort of a blend where a lot of epic fantasy and fantasy in general, there's never any societal advancement. Like Jon Snow was the 999th Watcher on the Wall, and he was still using a sword and riding a horse, right? So you're talking about thousands of years. In my realm, I've sprinkled in a little bit of sci-fi, and instead of having a Pentagon, I have a city called Abacus, which is a city that is a scholar city, and it advances things. So you will see scientific advancement in some of those devices, kind of like James Bond's Q. He always just happens to have that right item at the right time in the James Bond novels that saves him or gets him to finish his mission. These are used by both the villains and the good guys, and it really kind of tips the battle or tips a duel or tips something in their direction. And I think that's kind of fun, right? And I don't see that a lot in my genre. So I was able to use those real life characters and kind of put a spin on them and really know how a president will react and how we would, so I've got a city called Castleshire, which is my United Nations, and you have all of these barons and kings and empresses coming together to negotiate there because they have to, right? And so there's it's taking those lessons from real life and baking them into what I think is a real nice epic fantasy story that has a little bit of a different spin than you might read anywhere else.
It sounds amazing. And I never really was too much into fantasy, but now I'm absolutely gonna check out these
Ah,
books.
reeling you in, reeling you
I
in.
am. Oh no. Oh no. But you know, it's funny because I've read so much nonfiction. I've tried to read fiction, but I haven't been like, oh, this is so good. And that's why I read like the 33 Strategies of War, which is my favorite book. I absolutely love this. In fact, I have it right here in front of me by Robert Greene, because I love how he goes through the story and history and then applies how we as people via our human nature and interpretation of these laws and how they apply to people. And I love the dark and the light. I don't think that anything is as black and white as it is. And I think also too, I know you're just a little bit younger than me, but how do you see the generational shift in what is written and what is read?
Well, there's two ways I can answer that question. The first way is a lot of my stuff is sort of antiquated. It's anachronistic because of the millennials through Gen Z and now what will be Gen Alpha really don't have an attention span, and what happens is that it impacts the way you're delivering this. So if you handed them a book or you have them a movie that's 3 hours long, they can't sit through it. And part of that is just being on their phone all the time, right? And they have instant gratification. They want to be able to binge something on Netflix this weekend, or they want all their books available right away. And in the past, you can get away with writing a book this year, and then the next book comes out next year, and giving you time to do that. And there's a level of impatience, and there's also a level of attention span that doesn't exist. And so you'll see the advent of things like Kindle Vella, which you get instant gratification in the sense that the chapters are very digestible. They're nuggets, with 1,200 or 1,500 words in them, and you can read them on the bus or the subway to work because that's how people are digesting their stuff. Or now they're listening to it as opposed to reading it, because sitting down and reading a book, people are in different places in their life, and so you might be at the ball game with your kids and you can get away with sneaking one of these AirPods in as opposed to sitting there not watching the game, reading the book. So I think that's changed as well, which is also forced to change in publishing. So you'll see in my marketplace something called rapid release, where you can't allow your audience to kind of fade away because they're not going to wait a year for another book. They want something in the next 3 months at most. And so you have to write faster. And a lot of authors, instead of writing faster, are writing chunks. So they'll write an entire series and then meet it out over the course of a year, as opposed to, writing one and then going on to the next and writing the next and writing the next. They're coming at it from a big chunk perspective. So they are bingeable. And I think we're seeing a lot of that with the younger generation, millennial on back.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I love that. I think that's actually a great way. I see nothing wrong with that. It's like, why wouldn't you want to take things as chunks? We don't it just makes it more yummy because it keeps you enthralled and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I know that there's a lot of people from probably my generation that's like, oh gosh, but I think that you have to understand that this is the way that information is gathered. So when you're thinking about when you went from your other job to this, what were some things that were very different for you? Because I can't imagine going from this really super high powered, having to negotiate, having to be with people, cutthroat, like intense, like do or die kind of environment, legit, to this new realm.
Well, the short answer is everything. It's so hard to describe it because it's my old job, it's pressure filled. You have to know every little bit of everything you're involved in. You can't not have an answer. In this, you don't have any answers. You're writing. So you have to figure out what the characters are going to do, all this stuff. But there was also a zero-sum game, where if I didn't perform for my client, I was replaced. If I was in a debate, I had to win or I was going to lose. And if you're getting a bill passed or getting a bill stopped from being passed, there are a bunch of things, factors that go into that, and you're always fighting. There's always conflict, and there was no downtime. Like holidays that didn't exist. You were trying to gain information and knowledge during those times when people weren't doing anything and trying to unplug so that you had an advantage when game was on again. In the
Mhm.
realm of creativity, there's none of that. Like this is a true story. My first interview as an author, um, I studied for 2 days for it because in my, if I went on a TV show, a radio show, podcast as a political hack, and I didn't have all the answers, the host was going to come at me with a gotcha moment, and or whoever they had as the foil on the show was going to say, well, you're wrong because of this, and then I had to counter their point, and then I was countering their counters. My first interview, the guy literally said to me, what time of year do you prefer to write in? And you want to talk about a light bulb going off. It was like
Wow.
snap. It was like night and day. And I said to myself, is this guy really trying to help me? And he was, and you
Wow.
get this, authors help other authors. They give you insights. They provide here's some of my beta readers that are really good. Oh, you should really use this editor. Don't do this because it didn't work for me. And there's this stock and trade, which is, I'm going to help you because we're all on the same team. I want to read your good stuff and you want to read my good stuff, or we're going to help one another. And I think that my over the last 2.5 years of doing this, what I've identified is you get that in all forms of art, whether it's sculpting, whether it's, literally paint on a canvas, or writing like I do, acting, it doesn't matter. Like everybody's out there. I'm not saying there's not people out there that are not going to help you, but there's a community of that's trying to lift you up. And I went from a community that was punching you in the face and you just had to survive. And so I feel a little weird, because it's like I've spent the first 20 years of my life fighting every day, and I got this thick skin, and and I've had people say, oh, well, I'm sorry, we can't accept you this year for your, but please apply next year, because, and I'm like, okay, I'm on to the next. Like for me, I'm used to getting to, and they're not used to that kind of response. Like, all right, I don't hate you for you saying no. I just expected you to say no. So I'm ready. And that part to me has been the most refreshing. And it makes me want to transition to this this is what I want to do until I retire, because there is no pressure. I wake up every day, I go to a coffee shop and I write. I do a
Mhm.
couple of interviews, and every now and then I'm at a convention somewhere. I go to a library. I mean, that's not pressure at
It
all.
sounds
It's just
delicious.
not. It's just entirely
Yeah.
different than what I've
So
been
how
doing.
did that
So
shift your relationships? Like your marriage, your relationship with your kids, your family, because that's just like another you. I mean, I'm sure I don't know what your relationship was with your mom, but I'm just curious about like what's her perspective. I'll always just ask this usually, but like what's your perspective of your mom's vision of you?
yeah, so I'll attack that in two ways as well. I'll give you my mom and give you my wife. So my mom never got why I wanted to be in politics. She never understood it, and always tried to convince me to be IT guy or do something else. And then she didn't want me owning my own business because that was risky, and you should get a job and stay there for 30 or 40 years. And it was a generational thing there too, right? So there's a
Sure.
point where that was the American dream. You got a job, stay at the job, don't risk it. Exactly. And then my generation was more entrepreneurial, and that was a way to, assure security for your family, was not necessarily going to work somewhere. It was working for yourself. And so for me, I
Mhm.
never had those problems, but she was always trying to dissuade me from doing that. And it wasn't me rebelling against it. It's just I was born to do this kind of stuff. Like for me, torture would be going and working in a corporation somewhere and punching a clock and 3 weeks vacation and a 401k. It's just not me. I just don't
Mm-mm.
fit into that mold. My wife loved the change. And part of it is when I travel, it's typically somewhere relatively close. It's not for weeks on end. When DC was in session, I was gone at least Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, if not longer. And I was gone most of the year because we didn't live in DC. But this is different. I can get up when I want. I can go to bed when I want. I'm around more. You know what I mean? From a family perspective, even all that kind of stuff. It's just
And
a
she
lot
wants you
easier.
around.
So right, that's exactly right. So now this is much
JV.
better for her, right? So it's like, hey, I don't have to. And when I go away, she won't mind like sometimes she'll travel with me, not all the time. But there are times like when I would go to DC, she never wanted to be involved. It was just ugly. She didn't want to. No, I'm not doing that. But for this, it's like, hey, I'm going to a convention. I'm speaking at this convention. I'm selling books. Do you mind? Do you want to come and help? And then we could travel together. And it's low. I mean, DC, I'm going there and I'm going to get my head beat in, and she doesn't want to see that and can't add any value. If I go
Right.
to a convention, she gets to see the people walking around in cosplay. She gets to meet actors and actresses that are there. She gets to listen to me speak. She can help me sell books, and it becomes something that she can be involved in at a greater level. Plus, like you said, I'm around more. So from my mom's perspective, there was a sigh of relief that I got out of what I was doing because she never saw why I was doing it. And for my wife's relief was a sigh of relief, or from my wife's perspective was a sigh of relief in a different direction, where it's like, wow, I'm actually going to see my husband.
Oh
So it
my
worked out
gosh.
best.
So you're
It's the
the
best of both
opposite.
worlds.
You're the positive statistic of COVID, where a lot of marriages
Yeah,
blew up.
yeah.
It
Nah,
was
nah.
either do or die in that situation
It was
for a
great.
lot of
It would
people.
have blown up for me if I'll tell you, this is how this happened. She said, "You're going to drive me nuts. Go do something." Because I can't have you sitting around doing nothing. Because if you can't tell, I'm a ball of energy. So I was like, well, I'm going to go write that book. And she was like, whatever, just do whatever you got to do. Just go and do it. And then the book became successful. And then it became a series. And now it's become much more. And she's happy that she gave me that piece of it. And she would be the first one to tell you that it was all her idea. And it's kind
Yeah,
of true.
exactly. She kicked your ass out the door and said, go
Yeah.
write the damn book and get out of my hair. And I'm locking the door after you.
That's right. That's right.
Like legit. So were you who did you want to be when you grew up? Like when you were a kid, who did you want to be?
Well, I wanted to be a senator or a congressman. It was something I was born. I always knew, like, in all honesty, I loved it. And I was always attracted to it. I always took all the poli sci, all the history classes, all the economics classes. I was nerding out on that stuff. I just knew that I would get into that profession in some capacity. I always knew that I wanted to do that. But
What was it?
it's
What interested you about it?
um, in all honesty, there was a lot of things, right? Like if you can't tell the epic fantasy side of me, I like the idea of long history and understanding how things came to be. I love the
Yes.
geography of the worlds and the geopolitical stuff that happened because of that, as well as the socioeconomic things that happened for that. And I think that, at the time that I was going through the public school system, there wasn't as much politics in the history, where now it depends on where you go to school, you're going to get a different kind of indoctrination. That wasn't the case. It was before. It was like,
Mm.
we're in America because of all of these reasons. And you learn about, the religious freedoms, you learn about personal liberties and all those kind of things. And and for me, that was super attractive. And I really liked it. And I thought, well, I would love to be involved in this. What I didn't realize was that, you know, becoming a senator is one of 100 people in the country that are that, and it's really tough. And most of them have a lot more money than I did, and little things you think about. But it was enough that got me interested in the system, and so I played at the level, and I made a really comfortable career out of doing what I was doing prior to that. And so, for me, I think that's what attracted me to it. But at the end of the day, it's as seedy as you would think it would be. So it's like I'm kind of
Right. Well,
glad
it's
that I'm
another
not
version.
playing in it.
Yeah, it's another version of warriorship for you. It's
Mhm.
kind of interesting because I think I wrote a book called Claim Your Inner Warrior, dedicated to my son who I lost in 2017 to suicide. And I'm super committed to helping, in particularly in my coaching business, helping men embrace their warriorship, because I think in our culture, it's been whitewashed. It breaks my heart. But it seems as though you are a warrior, and you had that commitment early on. I had this really interesting image, Av, when you were talking about like in school wanting to learn, and like, but also being super high energy, probably ADHD like me. But it sounds like the same thing with you. Like learning calmed you down. Like the more you could take in of all the dimensions of things, it literally calmed your mind.
Well, I can talk about that in a few different ways. Getting back to your warrior comment, my family, every male in my family served in the military until me. I was the first person in either side of my family to go to college, and I played hockey in college, and there's a lot of that stuff. So I grew up in a warrior with a warrior mentality. My
Love
uncle
that.
was paralyzed in the war. He was a Marine. My mom was his nurse when he came home, and he was a second father to me. So I lived literally, I was, 4 days a week. I was so I was reading before I went to kindergarten. I was doing algebra way before other people. And so for me, because he was very limited in what he could do, right? And his escapism was playing Dungeons and Dragons with me, or he was also a writer. So of course I emulated him. He wrote different things. Like he wrote short stories and pulp fiction of the day that would end up in magazines for, horror and suspense stuff. My genre just happened to be fantasy adventure, which is my level of escapism, and I learned it through his level of escapism. And
Wow.
it was this coming together of getting read The Hobbit in the fourth grade by a substitute teacher, and him giving me a Dungeons and Dragons set when I was 10 and saying, let's play this game, because he couldn't go anywhere. He's bedridden and he was looking
Mm,
out his window. And so this was a way for him to escape his physical limitations. But because he was military, it was always keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, keep your mouth closed kind of stuff. And, I just fell into that very naturally. So even when I went to DC, instead of being the warrior on the battlefield, I was rattling sabers, right? It was a different kind of
exactly.
diplomacy,
Yes.
but I already
Same
knew
thing.
that. I did. Yeah. And when I was on the Hill, I worked for a senator that was on armed services. I did military and veteran affairs for 6 years. And then that became working with the Defense Department and other defense agencies related to that, because I was steeped in it my entire life. I understood it,
Exactly.
and it was second nature for me. So that's part one. But part two of your question is, for me, I think part of that is not getting back to your assertion about fear earlier. I've never had fear about this kind of stuff. I always knew that it was gonna work out for me. And there were times where I had problems in school, not necessarily with the grades, but with teachers and disagreements. And I was a little bit more strong-willed than I should have been, maybe at ninth, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, like that kind of stuff. But ultimately, for me, I got a lot of that out on the ice. I got a lot of that
Yes.
out, in just physical assertion and things like that too, which, you know, helped me concentrate more in the classroom. But I've always been a sponge for that kind of stuff. I've really enjoyed it. And, reading any of those kind of history books just gets you ginned up. And like Patton, you mentioned Patton earlier. Patton had this belief that he was from a different era. Like he actually served Napoleon. He actually was there when the
Right.
when the Romans fought the Mesopotamians and the Greeks. Like lived other lives. I don't have that same belief, but
Right.
ultimately, I feel like there are eras in history, and I do a lot of that. I'll take battle scenes, or I'll take
It's amazing.
geopolitical situations and bake them into my stories to make it a
Love
little
it.
bit more believable. Because when you're writing fantasy, you have to force the reader to suspend disbelief, because they're going to get in this system of magic in a community that doesn't exist, in a world that doesn't exist, and you got to base some of it on realism. And if they see something that's familiar to them, even though it's might be written differently with different names and magic thrown about, it doesn't matter. It's a little bit more believable for them.
It's so good. But I do believe that this is just another aspect of your warriorship in a way. Like, I think that in many ways you were given that sword and shield at birth through your heritage, and now you're continuing that. I hear the commitment and the confidence of a warrior.
Yeah, for me, I was close. I joined I had been accepted in the Air Force ROTC, and which I thought everybody was going to be proud of. And my uncle, the one that was paralyzed, said to me, he's like, "Don't do that. You're the first one of us. We served so that you can go to college." And he's like, "You don't want to end up like me. You do what you need to do. Take the principles that he instilled in me and move it forward and serve." And I served through public service. I worked 6 years for a U.S. senator on the Hill, and then obviously the kind of technology that I brought to the Hill was going to save warfighters' lives and things like that. Yet I was never on the front line. And he was the one that told me, he's like, some people, and I think it likened it to a history where, you were given red or black, and black meant you went to the military, red meant you went into the clergy back in the day as a someone that was royal, because there were two sets of things. In my case, I had the ability and then the chance to do that, but instead, I chose to do something more that would be likened to diplomacy, or a form of it,
Right. But
and
that's still war.
negotiation.
Like, even think of the generals, right? The generals are in many ways, they're creating the plan, and the plan, and they know, the general knows that people are going to get axed on the front line. It's just, it's a measure of risk. it's all a management of risk, right? But I love it that I think you do live the principles though.
I try, you know, and I bake them into my stories. There's a lot of militarism in the stories for a variety of reasons. One, you know, you can't pick up a fantasy book without there being a lot of action in it, right? So of course there's going to be action, but ultimately I think it makes for good plot lines, you know, and they're believable plot lines, which is important.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it sounds so interesting. I'm like dying. Can't wait. So I would love it too if someone is listening and it was like, "Oh my gosh, I would love to become a writer." What would you suggest?
I would suggest three things. The first is make sure that you write every day. And it doesn't have to be, I'm going to write a chapter a day or some word counts. Some people do morning words where they get up and they write a certain amount of words before their day starts. All those they're nice habits to have, but my habit is writing something every day. And it doesn't have to be super constructive. It could be just outlining something, but it gets you in the habit of it. And then when you don't do it, you feel like you missed the gym. You feel fat. You're like, I gotta should be doing something. That doesn't mean you don't take vacations or holidays. Everybody does, but ultimately, it's something that gets you into that habit. Secondly, I would tell them, using your sword and shield example, to have a thick skin, put on your armor, because not everything you write is going to be accepted. Um, and you're going to get a lot of constructive criticism and some unwarranted, by the way.
Oh
When I say
yes.
that, like you know, I just got my fourth book and the final installment in the Warminster saga was released last Friday, and I'm starting to get reviews from people that bought it. And so far, I've got 4 5-star reviews and 1 3-star review. And the guy that gave me the 3-star review, which is still a decent review, said, "I've loved this series, but the ending, he didn't give me a hint as to what was coming next. I didn't know what ended. It was like it ended." Well, of course I didn't, because that's going to be the next series. But
Exactly.
you know, I literally in my head it spun around for like 10 seconds, and it's like, hey, I hear what he said. I won't make that mistake next time. Maybe I'll do an epilogue or something. And I pushed it out. You just have to learn from those things. I got
Sure.
a 2-star review once where the woman said, "I wanted to like this book. I love the cover. I went home, bought it, read it, couldn't finish it, did not finish, got 50 pages in, 2 stars." And what I took from that was she liked the cover. So the cover did its job, right? And so you just have to
Right.
pick take the bitter with the better, and figure out what she's saying. And in this case, you know, become better at that stuff. So that would be number two. So write every day, have a thick skin. And then three, do not be afraid to share your work with other people, because you know, two heads are better than one, 20 heads are better than two. And what I mean by that is, before my book ever is published, the fantasy, the romance of me sitting around a fire drinking coffee and writing a book, no, this is a team sport. It goes to a development editor. It goes from that development editor back to me. I fix all the problems with plot holes and things like that. It goes back to that development editor. That development editor then sends it back to me a second time. And then I send it on to a copy line editor who checks it for grammar, spelling, punctuation, comes back to me. Then I send it out to beta readers. And beta readers are people that are going to read it. It's like going to a movie before it's released, and then you give your opinion on it and say, well, this didn't connect for me, or why did you do this ending instead of this ending? And you listen to that, and then you go back and fix all those errors, and then it goes back to those beta readers. And when you have the majority of them nodding their head saying that's really good, then it goes back to your copy line editor, then it goes to your final editor, and then it goes on to your publisher. So by the time that actually hits, before you pick up Echoes of Ghostwood this weekend, 20 people read it, and they're all professionals, and they're saying, okay, this is good enough to publish. And so if you didn't share that, you're not going to know. And sometimes their opinions matter when sometimes you're so close to it, you're nose blind, and you just don't see the errors, or you think you wrote it because it happened in your head. But if it didn't happen in Kate's head, then it didn't happen in the book. So I've got to make sure that they're there, and they pick up on all those things, and it helps you fill those holes before it becomes a problem, you know, in the public circuit. So those are the three things I would suggest.
Yeah. So it's a team sport.
One heck
I
of a
like the
team
line
sport.
pick the bitter, bitter. What'd you say? Pick the bitter
Oh,
at
you have
the
to take the bitter with the better. That's
take
an
the bitter
old
with the
English.
better.
My grandfather was British, so he would say you have to take the bitter with the better, meaning basically good things and bad things are going to happen, and you can't just have good things. So
Right.
you got to take the
Suck it
bitter with
up.
the better. Yeah.
But I like it that you bring people in, that the whole idea. And I think that that's great because it really does require you to have the tougher skin. And I just finished writing a book. Well, the first draft called The Agility Mindset. I write mostly nonfiction because I'm in the personal development space. But it has this, and because as I mentioned earlier that I coach mostly men, it had this element of how the whole image or this what we're getting pitched in society, the balance is something that's attainable. And I just say balance is bullshit. There's no such thing. And it really is about who are you here to impact. So if you focus on embracing your gifts, and then as Patton in this book 33 Laws of Power talks about, is that in the line of fear and courage, which for you and I is kind of like, all right, well, I'm always used to fear. It kind of just feels like a little uncomfortable. In the mist is what that Patton saw. He was looking in the mist and he saw his ancestors that said, freaking charge, take the freaking step, dude. Right. Because he's from a military family. And I love it that you just shared with me that he actually, he thought he was from, Napoleon. What a story. I'm sure you've weaved some of his stories into your stories, but what is it for you? What's in the mist for you, calling you forth to drive you forward? Who are you here to serve, JV?
Well, serve is a tough word, because what I do now and what I did then are two different things. Like before, it was providing for the common defense, bringing the best technology forward to help the American warfighter, right? That's an easy one to define. This one is so different that the way I would describe it is my mission is to entertain. And, as goofy as that sounds, because that's a left brain, right brain thing, there are two different aspects of it. In the end, if you read my book and you're entertained, I did my work, right? I'm giving you a level of escapism because when I needed to escape the real world, I read fantasy. I played Dungeons and Dragons. I did all those things. And that was my form of escapism. So sci-fi and fantasy was a way for me to escape. And so many of my readers are doing the same thing, right? They are spending their entertainment dollars finding something that will entertain them. And when you read a book, that's an investment. It's not, I mean, it's like going to a movie, except it takes a lot more than 3 hours to read. And when you read a book, you're invested in those characters. They become part of you. And as part of that, you cheer for the good things that happen, and then you bemoan the bad things that happen. So, for me, I always look at it and say the mission now is to entertain people so that they buy the next book and the next and the next, and therefore I can provide for the family. But ultimately, I would love to see this stuff, and it's already started to create in different forms of media. In this case, a video game, augmented reality, virtual reality game. Next is a graphic novel. Maybe one day it ends up as a like a tabletop role playing game, or ends up in a movie somewhere. That's what I would love to see, because then your story has been memorialized, and it lasts way beyond me, right? It's now everybody's to share. And I think the most humbling thing that I've had happen to me is when you're at a convention or you're at a book signing and people come up and ask for permission to write fan fiction, or they give you fan art where they literally are handing you something where they paid money to get in the door. They flew or they drove or they're staying overnight. They find you. They come to your table to buy your book and tell you something about it. That's how impassioned they are about it. And you feel a sense of responsibility to them, where it's like, I've had people say, please don't kill this character, or I would like to see this happen. And you've already written it. Like, you already know what's going to happen. You can't say anything. So you sit there and you're like, yeah, okay, I got you, that kind of stuff, but ultimately you learn from it. Right. So like for me, I've got this gap year between my next trilogy and the end of this trilogy. So what I've done is I've written 3 origin stories of the most popular characters in the book, some of which will not be in the second series because they don't make it through the first. But those are the ones that I got the most feedback from, both positive and negatively, because people love to hate them or people just love to cheer for them. And so I've written their origin story. So there's a history there, and it'll also keep people, paying attention to the series while I'm writing the next series. And
Holy
so for
crap.
me, I have to listen to that stuff, and for me, it makes a lot of difference. So the win at the end of the day was, did you buy the book and were you entertained? And if that's the answer to the question is yes, then I did my job, and that's what motivates me.
Well, you really are the strategist. I just keep having this image of you like as the general in the war room with the maps all opened up. And then, and it requires a Herculean amount of energy and brain and energy and all of these things to be able to put this on the map. Do you draw out maps? Do you use any diagrams in your drawing, in your production?
As you can imagine, the answer is yes. If you went to the website, you would see that there's a map that I had created so that people can follow along. There is a royal line, so you have a family tree and you can follow along. There's a map of it's basically what I would describe as kind of like a flow chart for the Cathedral of the Watchful Eye, so you can understand what the roles of the different religious sects are. And then you're right. If you went into my den where I write, you'd see a whiteboard, and it looks like a March Madness thing where you have all of these plot lines and character arcs intersecting until it gets to the end. And as stupid as this is going to sound, I write from backwards to forward. So like I'll write my ending first, then I go back and write the beginning, and then I fill in the middle. And as I fill in the middle, everything on that whiteboard gets erased until there's nothing there. And that way, everything that I plan on having in the novel is baked into it. Now, I know that's not how everybody writes. I don't know why I write that way, but that's the way I do that. Some people, like Stephen King, he writes by the seat of his pants. He just starts writing because he has a story in his head and he doesn't know where he's going. Right? Me, I always know where I'm going. And so if there's a detail in my book, it's because it's not by accident. It's there for a reason, no matter how minute. It could be the color of the coat of arms that they're wearing or the sigil of the flag. There's a reason I'm telling you that, or else it doesn't matter, right? And so I think that's when people read my stuff, I articulate it in a way that I think they understand the amount of precision that I've tried to hone in on this stuff, so that there are no plot holes and that they can refer to something they've read in the past and it makes sense for them as they continue to read forward.
So it sounds as though you feel a responsibility to do it to excellence. Yes.
Oh, I have obsessive compulsive disorder, if you can't tell. So it runs in my family. And so I don't have a choice. When I was
Wow.
young and I was diagnosed, that they look at it as like it's a problem, but when you live it, you don't know any better. And so the only thing you can do is make it an asset. And so it makes me a perfectionist, right? And if I don't get it right, I obsess about it. Or here's the other thing too. There are mistakes in the first three books. I'm sure there's mistakes in this fourth book. And no matter how many times you edit it, no matter how many people read it, you won't see it until someone points it out to you because you're still close to it. And then for a day, it throws me off. Like I'll be like, how do I go back and change that? I'm going to fix it. And it's nothing crazy. Like there's no plot holes or whatever, but sometimes you misname a character, or there's a spelling thing that everybody missed when they were reading it. And those kind of things eat me alive. So I have turned my level of OCD into, and I don't, and I look, I know people use that flippantly these days, about how I'm OCD on it. You're not OCD. If you're counting steps, you're OCD. If you're me, you're OCD. If you just forgot something or you don't like to do it a certain way, that's not, but
Yeah.
I don't take offense to that stuff. I just realize people are trying to identify. But for me, I've taken something that should be a problem and made it an asset.
Debilitating.
Yeah, I just made
Debilitating.
it an asset. It's just
Right.
you have to learn how to do it, or you live with it. So it's no
And
longer a disability.
yeah. And what was is your uncle still alive?
No, he died through. Well, he was paralyzed and bedridden for about 21 years after the war, and then he passed
Mm.
because of a variety of health issues. I mean,
Right.
when
What's
you're
his name?
Joe Hilliard.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh my
there's
God.
yeah, he didn't have the
Well, I just want
V.
to say I'm grateful for him. I'm grateful that you introduced us to him in this conversation, because he's the legend in the stories too, right? Because he birthed this and he encouraged you in your path of excellence and a high principle. It's pretty amazing. I'm
Well, you'll see
super
that if you
grateful.
read the books. I've embedded him in a character who's Uncle Kester. Uncle Kester is the main character is a like a 18, 20-year-old kid named Damus Alaric. And Damus, is a little different than me, so it wasn't written about me, but his Uncle Kester was my Uncle Joe. And so Uncle Kester helps him break free because all these bad things are happening to him and he's got to get his stuff together. And so he's sort of like my Obi-Wan Kenobi, or my Hagrid, like that kind of stuff, to use a Harry Potter term,
Right.
that kind of stuff where and so Uncle Kester helps Damus out, at a great sacrifice to himself, as part of it. But that was a way for me to memorialize his role in my life in a character in the book that made sense is following along, so like that same path
Wow.
as part of that. So yeah, it was
Wow,
big
that gets
part.
me all emotional out, dude. That's a powerful, powerful. It's so funny. Like, I don't know why I keep seeing, like, for you and just the way you communicate, I feel like I'm in your world. And it's familiar in my business. But for you, it's like I literally see the whiteboard. Like, I see it around you, I see you in it. And it's just freaky. It's absolutely freaky.
Yeah,
Oh my
well, I'm
God,
glad you
two freaky
do.
minds.
I'm glad you do, because I'm telling you right now, not everybody within this household sometimes accepts the way I do things.
I
So I
understand.
was living with OCD and having it are two different things.
No,
So
I
she's
understand
she's
and I
put up with a lot
appreciate
with
you.
me.
Yeah, I have to find someone that can put up with that part of me, because if they saw the number of books and everything else, they'd be like, right, I can't help it. I have piles of paper, like, because I take notes on everything I hear. Like for you, I can't even count the number of pages because I find it fascinating. It's how I remember and I weave it all together. So it's just like magic. I think it's magic. I think people's stories are magic. And I want to say, JV, thank you for sharing your magic with our listeners and viewers who are going to totally dig this episode. I'm so
I
grateful
hope
for
we do.
you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm grateful for you having me on. I mean, I love meeting people, and people that watch your podcast may not be the same readers, and I'm hoping that I might be able to, sucker. Excuse me, I don't mean sucker. I mean convince them to buy my books and check it out, and maybe they'll like it too.
I'm like, duh, look at me already dying. So listen, we're going to make sure to get all of JV's books, links in the show notes. Buy his books. Your latest book is called what, JV?
It's called Echoes of Ghostwood, which is book 4 of the Warminster saga, which you can find fairly ubiquitously. If you shop on Amazon, you can get it there. You can go to my publisher, Dragon Moon Press, and get it, or you could find it at, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, wherever you shop for books. And it will soon be on an audiobook format, and you'll be able to find that on Audible and iTunes and a million places where they're available as well.
Wow, right on. Well, here to your success. Keep leaning in. I'm so grateful for you, and I'm grateful for your Uncle Joe and all the goodness you bring to the world. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And thanks to all the viewers and listeners for tuning into this totally cool episode. I loved it. Have a beautiful day. And remember, your life can be an epic and dark fantasy, and it also can be amazing in any way that you choose. So dig in to your fantasy life, grab a book, and read and enjoy every aspect along the way. Be well, everyone.